Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Poor Miss Rottenmeier. She thought her idea of bringing a companion for Clara Sesemann would give her some relief from the hard work of caring for the girl. But now that Heidi has arrived, life is more surprising and disorganized than she ever would have believed. Heidi, on the other hand, is trying to find something in this new life that will bring her some happiness. She has already made a great friend and ally in Sebastian, and after an episode with some kittens, she knows she can rely on him to help her. But oh, how she longs for her high mountain pasture, and the fir trees, and the long view from her Alpine home. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Heidi, Chapter 7. Miss Rottenmeier has a tiring day. When Heidi opened her eyes on that first morning in Frankfurt, she could not make up her mind at all what she was looking at. She rubbed her eyes as hard as she could, then peered out again and saw the same things as before. She found that she was sitting up in a high white bed, and before her was a big wide room, and where the light came in, there hung very long white curtains. Nearby stood 2 chairs with large flowers on them. Then came a sofa with the same flowers by the wall, and a round table before it. And in the corner stood a wash table with things on it, the like of which Heidi had never seen in her life. But then, all at once, she remembered she was in Frankfurt. The previous day came back to her mind, and finally, even the clear teachings the lady had given her, at least so far as she had heard them. Heidi sprang from her bed and dressed herself. First she went to one window and then to the other, for she had to look at the sky and the earth outside. The great curtains made her feel as if she were shut up in a cage. She could not push these to one side, so she crept in behind them to reach the window. But this was so high that Heidi was just able to reach up far enough to see through, and she did not find what she was looking for. She ran from one window to the other, and then back to the first again. But always the same view was before her eyes, walls and windows, and still other walls and windows. Heidi became quite afraid. It was still early in the morning, for she was used to rising early up on the mountain meadow, and going at once out of doors to see what the weather was, whether the sky was blue and the sun were already shining, whether the fir trees were rustling and the eyes of the little flowers were open. Heidi kept running from one window to the other, as a small bird which is put for the first time in a beautiful shining cage darts hither and thither and tests all the bars to see if it cannot somehow slip between them and regain its freedom. She tried to open a window, for it must be that one could then see something else than walls and windows. Down below there must surely be the ground, with green grass and the last melting snow appearing on the slopes, and Heidi fairly ached to see those things. But the windows remained firmly closed, no matter how much the child lifted and pulled, try as she would to get her small fingers under the sash in order to gain strength to raise them. Everything stuck together as hard as iron. After a long while, when Heidi saw that all her efforts were in vain, she gave up her plan and began to think how nice it would be to go outside and around the house to where the lawn was. For she remembered that last evening in front of the house they had walked on nothing but stones. At that moment there was a knock on her door, and right after it, Tinette thrust her head in and said shortly, "Breakfast is ready." Heidi did not know that these words were really an invitation. The scornful look on Tinette's face seemed to warn her to keep away, rather than to invite her to do anything. Heidi read the maid's look, and acted as it seemed to wish her to. She drew the small footstool out from under the table, put it in a corner, sat down upon it, and then waited still as a mouse to see what would happen next. After a little while, something came bustling along. It was Miss Rottenmeier. And again she seemed very excited and called out to Heidi from the doorway, "What's the matter with you, Adelheid? Can't you get it into your head what breakfast is? Come along." Heidi could understand such talk as that. She followed right after the housekeeper. Clara had been sitting at her place in the dining room for some time, and she looked up at Heidi with a pleasant greeting. She seemed to be happier than usual today, for she was expecting all sorts of strange things to happen that morning. The breakfast passed without any trouble, for Heidi ate her bread and butter just as she should, and when the meal was ended, Clara was wheeled back into the library. Heidi was told by Miss Rottenmeier to follow Clara and stay with her until Herr Kandidat arrived to begin the lessons. When the two children were alone, Heidi said at once, "How do you see out here and away down to the ground?" "Oh, you open a window and put your head out," Clara said, amused. "You can't open the windows," Heidi answered sadly. "Silly, of course they open. You can't do it, I suppose, and I can't help you either, but when you see Sebastian, he'll open one for you fast enough." Heidi felt much better to know that the windows would open and let her peer out, for the room still seemed to her like a prison. And now Clara began to ask Heidi questions about her home, and Heidi of course was glad to tell of the mountain meadow and the goats, of the hut in the pasture, and of everything she was so fond of. In the meantime, Herr Kandidat arrived, only Miss Rottenmeier did not lead him into the library as she usually did, because she wanted to talk with him first. So she asked him into the dining room, where she sat down before him and told him in great excitement of the awful situation she was in and how it had all come about. She said she had written some time before this to Mr. Sesemann, who was making quite a stay in Paris, telling him how for a long while his daughter had wanted to have a playmate in the house with her, how she herself had felt such a companion would be a spur to Clara in her studies and keep her from being lonely the rest of the time. To tell the truth, the scheme was a very good one for Miss Rottenmeier, since she was very glad to have someone there to help her take care of the sick Clara, a task that was often too much for her alone. Mr. Sesemann had answered her letter saying that he would be glad to do as his daughter wished, if the playmate was treated in every way as well as Clara herself. He wrote that he did not wish any drudgery put upon a child in the house. "And I think that was a most unnecessary thing for Mr. Sesemann to say," Miss Rottenmeier added, "for who wants to make a drudge of a child?" With that the lady went on to say how terribly she had been disappointed in the child. She told all the foolish things Heidi had done so far, to prove not only that Herr Kandidat would have to begin his lessons by teaching her the ABCs, but that from every possible point her training must start at the very beginning. Miss Rottenmeier said that she saw only one way out of this difficulty, and that was for the teacher to explain that it was impossible to teach two such different children together without doing real harm to the more advanced pupil. This, she thought, might be reason enough for Mr. Sesemann to put an end to the business, and he would then agree to have the child sent back to where she had come from. But Miss Rottenmeier, of course, did not feel she could do this without the consent of her employer, since he knew of the child's arrival. Now, the teacher was a timid person, and not quick to decide any matter. So he said comforting things to the housekeeper, and thought perhaps they would find that if the young child was not so well advanced in some ways, she might still know more in others. He felt they might even things up by being very careful about her teaching. Now, when Miss Rottenmeier saw that Herr Kandidat was not going to stand by her, but was going to try to teach the ABCs, she opened the library door for him, closed it quickly behind him, and remained on the other side, for she disliked the ABCs very much. Then she walked with great strides up and down the room, for she had to decide how the servants were to address Adelheid. Mr. Sesemann had certainly written that Heidi was to be treated as his own daughter, and this command of his had a special reference to the servants, the housekeeper thought. But she did not have long to think things over in peace, because all at once there came from the library a terrible crash of falling objects, and then a cry to Sebastian for help. She rushed into the other room. There on the floor everything lay in a heap. All the things they studied with, books, copybooks, the inkwell, and on top of them the table cover, from under whose edge a small stream of ink was flowing the whole length of the room. Heidi had disappeared. "Now she's done it!" cried Miss Rottenmeier, wringing her hands. "Carpet, books, wastebasket, swimming in ink! Such a thing never happened before. She's the child of misfortune, that's all there is about it." The scared teacher stood and stared at the work of ruin. Although he was not at all quick in deciding things, this was certainly very shocking. But the delighted Clara was looking at all these strange events and their results with high glee. She explained how it had all happened. "Oh, Heidi did it fast enough, but she didn't mean to. She was just in an awful hurry to get away, and she pulled the table cover off, so everything fell on the floor. A string of carriages was going past. That's why she flew out. I guess she has never seen a cab before." "Isn't that just what I was telling you, Herr Kandidat? The creature hasn't the first idea about things. She hasn't the least idea of what a lesson is, and that she ought to sit still and listen. But where is that imp of mischief? If she has run away, what on earth will Mr. Sesemann—" Miss Rottenmeier ran from the room and down the stairs. Here, down below the opened entrance door, Heidi was standing and peering in confusion up and down the street. "What's the matter with you? What are you thinking of? How can you run off in such a manner?" the housekeeper shouted at the child. I heard the fir trees rustling, but I can't find where they are, and I don't hear them any more," Heidi answered. She was looking with disappointment in the direction where the sound of the rolling carriages had died away. This noise had sounded to Heidi's ears like the roaring of the south wind among the firs, and she had followed its calling in the greatest glee. "Fir trees! Do you think we're in the woods? What silly notions! Come up and see what you've done." Miss Rottenmeier climbed the staircase again. Heidi followed meekly after and was very much surprised to see the great havoc she had created in the library. For so wild had been her haste to find the fir trees, she had not noticed what she was dragging after her. "You can do a thing like that once, but no more," Miss Rottenmeier said, pointing to the floor. "During your lessons, see that you sit still and pay attention. If you can't do that by yourself, I shall have to tie you in the chair. Do you hear me?" "Yes," Heidi answered, "and I'll sit very quiet now." For at last she understood it was the rule not to move about when a lesson was being given. Now Sebastian and Tinette had to come in to put things in order. Herr Kandidat departed, because any further teaching was impossible. There had been no excuse for Clara to sit and yawn that morning. In the afternoon, Clara always had to rest for a while, and Heidi could then busy herself in any way she wanted to. Miss Rottenmeier had explained all that in the morning. So when Clara had lain down in her chair to rest after dinner, the housekeeper went to her room, and Heidi saw the time had come for her to do whatever she pleased. This suited her fine, because there was something in her mind that she wished to try, but she could not do it without help. So she placed herself in the middle of the hall by the dining room in order that the person she wanted to see might not escape her. And sure enough, after a short wait, Sebastian came upstairs with the great tea tray on his arm, for he was carrying the silver up from the kitchen to put it away in the china closet of the dining room. When he reached the last step of the staircase, Heidi went up to him and said very distinctly, "You or he?" Sebastian opened his eyes just as wide as they would go and said very crossly, "What's that you're saying, mademoiselle?" "I'd like to ask you something, only really it's nothing naughty like this morning," Heidi added gently, because she noticed Sebastian still seemed a little vexed, as if he were thinking of the ink she had spilled on the floor. "All right, but first I should like to know about that you or he," Sebastian answered, still crossly. "Oh, that's what I have always to call you," Heidi declared. "Miss Rottenmeier told me to." At that, Sebastian laughed so loud that Heidi looked at him in surprise, for she had not seen anything funny. "And my name is not Mamselle either," the child said, in her turn a little angry. "My name is Heidi." "So it is, but the same lady has ordered me to say Mamselle," Sebastian declared. "Oh, she did? Then that must be my name," Heidi said obediently, for she had come to see that everything must go just as Miss Rottenmeier said. "So now I have 3 names," she said with a sigh. "But what was it that little Miss Mamselle wanted to ask?" Sebastian said, going into the dining room and putting the silver away in the china closet. "Show me how to open a window, Sebastian." "Here's the way to do it," he said, and he opened the great double window for her. Heidi went up to it, but she was too small to see out. She only reached up to the sill. "There you are. Now the little mamselle can peer out and see what's down below," said Sebastian, and he brought a high wooden footstool and put it in place. Heidi clambered up on this happily, and she could at last have the look she had so longed for. But, with a gesture of great disappointment, she drew in her head again at once. "You can't see anything but the stone street," Heidi said pitifully. "But if you go way round the other side of the house, Sebastian, what is there to see on that side?" "Just the same thing," he answered. "But where do you have to go to see far, far across the whole valley?" "For that, you have to climb up on some high tower like a church steeple. See the one over there with the gilt dome on it? From up there you can see ever so far." Now Heidi jumped down quickly from her stool, ran out of doors, and flew down the steps out into the street. But the affair did not turn out as she had thought it would. As she had seen the tower from the window, it had seemed as if she would only have to cross the street to find it right in front of her. But poor Heidi walked down the whole length of the street without coming to the tower, and she could not find the tower anywhere else. Down one street after another she walked, on and on, but still there was no steeple. A great many people passed her, but they all seemed to be in so much of a hurry that Heidi was sure they would have no time to direct her. Just then she saw a lad standing on the next street corner, who carried on his back a little hand organ, and on his arm the strangest sort of an animal. Heidi ran to him. "Where's the tower with the golden ball on top of it?" she asked. "Don't know," said the boy. "But who'll tell me where it is?" "Don't know." "Do you know any other church with a high tower?" "Surely." "Come on then and show it to me." "First you show me what you'll give me." The lad thrust out his hand. Heidi felt around in her pocket. Then she drew out a small picture in which a pretty wreath of red roses was painted. First she looked at it a little while, for she hated to lose it. Clara had given it to her just that morning. But oh, to look down into the valley across the green slopes! There you are, Heidi said, holding out the picture. Would you like that? The boy drew back his hand and shook his head. What do you want, then? Heidi asked, and put the little picture gladly back into her pocket. Money? I haven't any, but Clara has some that she'll give me. How much do you want? 5 pennies. Come on, then. So the two wandered down a long street, and on the way, Heidi asked her companion what he was carrying on his back. He told her that under the cloth there was a fine organ that made wonderful music when he turned a crank. Suddenly they were standing before an old church with a high tower. The lad halted and said, There you are. But how can I get in? Heidi asked, when she saw the tightly closed doors. Don't know, was the answer. Do you think you could ring here the way you do for Sebastian? Don't know. Heidi found a small bell in the wall and pulled at it with all her might. You must wait down here for me while I'm up in the tower. I don't know the way back any more, and you'll have to show it to me. What will you give me if I do? How much do I have to? 5 pennies more. Just then the old lock was turned from the inside, and the door creaked slowly open. An old man stepped out and looked at the children, first in surprise and then in some anger. He shouted at them, How dare you ring for me to come down? Can't you read what stands above the bell? For those who wish to climb the tower. The lad pointed silently at Heidi. Climb the tower is just what I want to do, Heidi said. What business have you up there? Asked the sexton. Did someone send you? No, the child said, only I'd like to go up so I could see down. You hurry and go home, and don't try that trick on me again, or you won't get off so easily next time. With these words, the sexton turned around and was going to shut the door, but Heidi held fast to his coat tail and said in a pleading tone, Oh, please, just this once. He looked behind him and saw Heidi's eyes fixed on his so pitifully that suddenly all his anger was gone. He took her hand in his and said gently, Why, if you want to go up so badly as all that, come on. The boy sat down on the stone before the door to show that he did not wish to go along with them. Heidi took the sexton's hand and climbed long rows of steps. They kept getting narrower and narrower, until finally there was a flight but little wider than a ladder. At last the two people were at the top. The sexton lifted Heidi up and held her in the open window. Now you can see down below, he said. Heidi looked down upon a sea of roofs, towers, and chimneys. She drew her head quickly back again and said, much disappointed, It's not anything like what I thought. Just what I expected, said the sexton. What can a little thing like you know about views? Well, come down now, and see you never ring a tower bell again. He set Heidi down on the floor and led the way to the narrow steps. Where these grew broader, there was a door on the left that opened into the sexton's room, and close by it, the flooring stretched out under the steep roof. In behind there stood a great basket, before which a gray fat cat was sitting and growling. For her family lived in the hamper, and she wished the passers-by to know they must not mix themselves up with her household affairs. Heidi stood stock still and looked surprisedly into the corner, for in all her born days she had never seen so huge a cat. Whole troops of mice lived in the old tower, and the old cat had no trouble in fetching home a half-dozen selected ones every day. The sexton saw Heidi's surprise, and he said, Come on, she won't hurt you while I'm here. Look at her kittens if you want to. Heidi walked over to the basket and fairly squealed with happy excitement. Oh, the cute little things, the cunning kittens, she cried again and again. She danced here and there about the basket, so as to be sure not to miss a single one of all the funny movements and leaps the 7 or 8 young kittens were making. They crawled, jumped, and fell over one another without stopping. "Would you like one for your very own?" asked the sexton, who smiled to see Heidi hopping around so happily. "All mine? To keep?" Heidi said. She was so excited she could scarcely believe her good fortune. "Yes, of course. You can have more, too. You can have them all if you find a place for them," the man answered. He was glad of a chance to get rid of the kittens without doing them harm. Heidi was very happy. Why, there was such lots of room for the little things in the big house. And wouldn't Clara be amazed and delighted when the cunning creatures arrived? "But how am I going to carry them?" Heidi asked. She started to catch some of them in her hands right away, but the fat cat jumped on her arm and snarled at her so fiercely that she started back in great fear. "I'll take them home for you if you'll tell me where to go," the sexton said. He stroked the old cat to quiet her again, for she was his friend, and had lived many years with him up in the tower. "To Mr. Sesemann in the great house. The front door has a gold dog's head with a thick ring in its mouth," Heidi explained. She did not have to tell the sexton that, for the sexton had been sitting in his tower for many years, and he knew every house in the whole district. Besides, Sebastian was an old friend of his. "Oh, I know," he said. "But whom shall I give the little fellows to? Shall I ask for you? You don't belong to Mr. Sesemann, do you?" "No, but Clara will be so happy when the kittens come." The sexton was going to start downstairs again, but Heidi just could not tear herself away from the interesting scene before her. "If I could only take 1 or 2 with me, one for me and one for Clara, don't you think I could?" "Just wait a second, then," said the sexton. He carried the old cat cautiously into his room and placed her in the cupboard. Then he closed the door on her and returned. "There, now you can take 2, he said. Heidi's eyes shone with happiness. She chose a white kitten and one with white and yellow stripes, putting them in the pockets of her skirt. And then they started on their way down. The lad was still sitting on the steps outside. When the sexton had shut the door behind Heidi, she said, "Which is the way to Mr. Sesemann's?" "Don't know," was the answer. Then Heidi began to describe for him as well as she could the front door, the windows, and the steps. But the lad shook his head at all her talking. He knew nothing about it. "You see," Heidi went on describing, "from its windows you could see a great big gray house, and here's the way the roof goes." With one finger she drew sharp points in the air. Ha! At that the lad jumped to his feet. He only needed signs like that to find his way. He kept running straight ahead, and Heidi ran after him. And in a short while, sure enough, they stood before the front door that had a dog's head in brass as its knocker. Heidi rang the bell. Sebastian soon appeared, but the moment he saw Heidi, he called out impatiently, "Hurry up, hurry up!" Heidi ran in as fast as she could, and Sebastian closed the door. He had not noticed the lad who was standing outside. "Quick, little mamselle!" Sebastian kept begging her. "Right in the dining room. They're already at dinner. Miss Rottenmeier looks like a loaded cannon. Whatever made little mamselle run away like that?" Heidi had walked into the dining room. Miss Rottenmeier did not look up from the plate. Clara said nothing either, and there was an unpleasant silence. Sebastian placed Heidi in her chair. The moment that she was in her seat, the housekeeper began to speak. Her face was very stern, and her voice most solemn. "Adelheid," she said, "I shall talk with you afterward, but at present I shall only say that you have been very naughty, and really ought to be punished for leaving the house without telling anyone or asking permission, and wandering around until late in the evening. I never heard of such a thing." "Meow," said a voice as if in answer. At that the lady grew angry indeed. "What, Adelheid?" she cried, and her voice kept rising higher and higher. "You dare make such a naughty joke after all your bad behavior! You had better look out, I warn you." I didn't say," Heidi began. "Meow, meow." Sebastian almost threw his tray on the table and fled away. "That will do," Miss Rottenmeier tried to say, but she had lost her voice in her excitement. Get up and leave this room," she cried after a moment. Very much scared, Heidi got up from her chair and once more tried to explain. "I didn't say meow, meow." "But Heidi," Clara went on to say, "really, when you see how cross you're making Miss Rottenmeier, why do you keep meowing?" "But I'm not," Heidi at last was able to say loudly enough to be heard. "It's the kittens." "What's that? What are you saying? Cats? Kittens?" shrieked Miss Rottenmeier. "Sebastian! Tinette! Find the terrible beasts and get rid of them!" And the lady rushed headlong into the library and bolted the door behind her to be safer from cats, which were to her the most awful things in all creation. Sebastian was standing outside the door and had to have his laugh out before he could come back in. While he was waiting on Heidi at table, he had seen the little head of a kitten peering out of her pocket, and had been expecting the scene that was to come. When it arrived, he could scarcely hold it in long enough to set the tray down on the table. At last, however, he was able to go back into the room in good order, but not until the lady's terrified cries for help had long ceased. Everything in the room was by that time peaceful and happy. Clara was holding the kittens in her lap. Heidi was kneeling down beside her, and both were joyously playing with the tiny, graceful creatures. "You must help us," Clara said to Sebastian as he entered. "You'll have to find a nest for the kittens, where Miss Rottenmeier won't see it, for she's afraid of them, and wants to get rid of them. But we want to keep the cunning little things, and fetch them out whenever we're alone. Where can you hide them?" "I'll tend to that all right, Miss Clara," Sebastian said good-naturedly. "I'll make a fine bed for them in a basket, and put them in a place that the timid lady will never discover. Trust that to me." Sebastian kept giggling a little every now and then as he went on with his work, for he thought, "There's going to be trouble, sure as you're born," which did not displease Sebastian, for he liked to see Miss Rottenmeier get excited. After some time, when it was almost bedtime, Miss Rottenmeier opened the door the least bit and called through the crack, "Have the terrible beasts been taken away?" "Oh, yes, long ago," Sebastian said. He had been finding work to do in the dining room, waiting for this question. Quickly and softly he took the kittens from Clara's lap and disappeared with them. The special scolding Miss Rottenmeier intended for Heidi was put off until next day. That evening the lady felt too worn out by the changing moods of anger, rage, and fright, which Heidi, without meaning to, had caused her. She retired in silence, and Clara and Heidi followed her contentedly, because they knew their kittens were in a good bed. Chapter 8. Excitement in the Sesemann house. The next morning, Sebastian had hardly opened the front door for Herr Kandidat and let him into the library, when somebody else rang the doorbell, but with such a noise that the servant almost tumbled downstairs in his hurry. "No one rings like that but Mr. Sesemann himself," Sebastian thought. "He must have returned ahead of time." He tore the door open. A ragged boy with a hand organ on his back stood before him. "What do you mean?" Sebastian yelled at him.
I'll teach you not to tear down doorbells. What do you want here?"
"I want to see Clara," was the answer.
"You little tramp! Don't you know enough to say Miss Clara? What's your business with Miss Clara anyway?" demanded Sebastian roughly.
"She owes me 10 pennies, the lad explained.
"You must be crazy. What makes you think a Miss Clara lives here?"
"I showed her the way yesterday for 5 pennies, and then I showed her the way back. That makes 10.
"Just to show what an awful lie you're telling, Miss Clara never goes out of the house. She can't walk a step. Come, run off to where you belong, or I'll give you a push."
But the lad was not in the least frightened. He did not move from the spot, and he said calmly,
"Just the same, I saw her on the street, and I'll tell you what she looks like. She has short curly hair that's black, and her eyes are black, and her dress is brown, and she can't talk the way we do."
"Oh ho," thought Sebastian, and chuckled to himself.
"That's little Mamselle who's been up to more mischief."
Then he pulled the lad inside and said,
"Right you are. Follow me, but wait outside the door until I come back again. If I let you go in, you must play something. Miss Clara likes to hear it."
When he was upstairs, he knocked at the library door and was told to come in.
"There's a lad here who has a message to give Miss Clara herself,"
Sebastian said gravely. Clara was much pleased to have such an unusual thing happen. "Tell him to come right in," she said. "You don't mind, Herr Kandidat, if he wants to give me the message himself?" The lad had already entered, and, just as he had been told to, he began at once to play his organ. In order not to have to listen to the ABCs, Miss Rottenmeier had been busying herself at different tasks in the dining room. Suddenly, she pricked up her ears. Did those sounds come in from the street? But they seemed to be so close to her. How could the tunes of a hand organ possibly be coming from the library? And still, they really seemed. She flew across the dining room and tore open the door. There! Would you believe it? There in the middle of the library was a ragged organ grinder, and he was playing his instrument with all his might. The teacher was evidently trying to say something, but you couldn't hear a sound he made. Clara and Heidi were listening with shining faces to the organ music. "Stop it! Stop it right away!" Miss Rottenmeier called into the room. Her voice was drowned by the music. So she ran straight for the lad. But suddenly she felt something between her feet. She looked down at her skirts. A frightful black beast was crawling under her skirts. A turtle! The housekeeper jumped high in the air, as she had not done for years, and screamed at the top of her lungs, "Sebastian! Sebastian!" All at once the organ grinder stopped playing, for this time her voice drowned the music. Sebastian was standing outside by the half-opened door, and he was bent double with laughter, for he had seen Miss Rottenmeier's mighty leap. At last he came in. The housekeeper had sunk down limply on a chair. "Away with them all, man and beast! Get rid of them on the spot, Sebastian!" she called to him. Sebastian obeyed willingly. He drew the lad away with him, and the turtle too, that was now tightly held in the boy's arms. When he had the lad outside, he pressed some money into his hand and said, "There's the 10 for Miss Clara, and 10 more for playing. You play fine." Then he closed the front door behind the strange guest. Everything was quiet again in the library. Once more the lessons had begun, and this time Miss Rottenmeier remained in the room to make sure that nothing further of a terrible sort should happen. She planned to look into the matter of the organ grinder after the study hours were over, and to punish the guilty person in a way that he would not soon forget. Before long there was another knock on the door, and Sebastian again appeared with the news that a large basket had been left at the door, to be given without delay to Miss Clara herself. "To me?" said Clara in surprise, and very eager to know what it might be. "Please, let me see at once what it looks like." Sebastian brought in a covered basket and went away again hurriedly. "I think you better finish your lesson first, and then unpack the basket," said Miss Rottenmeier. Clara cast longing eyes at the basket. For the life of her, she could not guess what it contained. At last, she stopped right in the middle of her grammar lesson. "Oh, Herr Kandidat," she sighed, "if I might take just one quick look, so I could know what was in it, then I'd go right on with my work."
"In one way, you might as well take a look," the teacher said. "In another way, you ought to wait. The reason for taking just one peep is that your whole mind is set on that thing anyway."
This speech was never finished. The cover of the basket was not fastened tightly, and at this moment 1, 2, 3 little kittens jumped out into the room, and then 2 more, and then even more. And they began to scamper around so like lightning that it seemed as if the whole room were full of the small animals. They leaped over Herr Kandidat's boots, nibbled at his trousers, climbed up Miss Rottenmeier's dress, scratched at her feet, jumped up on Clara's chair. They scraped and sprawled and meowed. The confusion was awful. Clara was in raptures and kept saying, "Oh, what sweet little kitties! What jolly jumps they make! See there, Heidi, look there! Oh, look at that one!" As to Heidi, she chased them joyously into all the corners. The teacher stood nervously by the table, lifting first one foot and then the other to avoid the sprawling things. For a few moments, Miss Rottenmeier sat speechless with horror, and then she began to howl at the top of her voice, "Tinette! Tinette! Sebastian! Sebastian!" She could not even pluck up courage to rise from her chair, because she feared all the little horrid beasts might jump on her at once. Her repeated calls for help finally brought Sebastian and Tinette. The butler packed the kittens one after the other back into the basket and carried them off to the bed in the basement, which he had made for the 2 kittens of the day before. This day again there had been no cause for yawning during the study hours. Later in the evening, when Miss Rottenmeier found herself somewhat rested from her excitement of the morning, she called Sebastian and Tinette upstairs to the library in order to talk over thoroughly the disgraceful things that had happened. And so it was discovered that the trip Heidi had made on the day before was the cause of all the trouble. The housekeeper sat there white with anger, and at first was unable to think of any words that would express her feelings. She waved Sebastian and Tinette out of the room, and then she turned to Heidi, who was standing by Clara's chair, and could not see that what she had done was wrong.
"Adelheid," she began in a stern voice, "I know of only one punishment which would be severe enough for you, because you are a wild girl. But let us see if down in that dark cellar with lizards and rats you will not become so tame that you will never try such tricks again."
Heidi listened quietly and in surprise to this judgment, for she had never been in a fearful cellar. The room next to the hut on the mountain meadow, which grandfather had called the cellar, was rather a nice and pleasant place. The ripe cheeses and the fresh milk were kept in it, and she had never seen any rats or lizards there. But Clara began to cry and wail. "No, no, Miss Rottenmeier, we must wait until Papa comes back. He wrote he was coming soon, and then I'll tell him everything, and he'll decide what must be done to Heidi." Miss Rottenmeier really could not object to Mr. Sesemann as chief judge in Heidi's case, and all the more because he was going to be home very soon. She got up and said somewhat sternly, "Very well, Clara, I am willing, but I too shall have a word to say to your father." And with that she left the room. There followed now 2 or 3 days of peace and quiet, But the housekeeper could not seem to get over her excitement. Every hour she kept thinking of how deceived she had been in Heidi. She felt as if things had been going wrong ever since the child first appeared in the Sesemann house, and as if they would never get any better. Clara was very happy. She never felt dull any longer, for Heidi made the study hours most amusing affairs. She really could not learn her letters, and always got them mixed. And just as Herr Kandidat would be in the act of explaining the form of some letter, and to make this clearer would be comparing it to some small horn or to the beak of a bird, Heidi would suddenly cry out joyfully, "It's a goat!" or "It's a bird of prey!" The descriptions of the teacher awakened all sorts of pictures in Heidi's small brain, but no idea of the letters. In the later hours of the afternoon, Heidi would sit again beside Clara and tell her so much about the mountain meadow and the life on it that she would become terribly homesick and would end by declaring, I'll really have to go right back home. I certainly must go back tomorrow." But when Heidi had such attacks, Clara would quiet her by saying that she surely must wait for Papa to come home. Then they could see together what was to be done about the matter. One happy thought that Heidi carried secretly in her mind made her quite willing to give up her own ways and be contented. This was the thought that every added day she stayed in Frankfurt, there would be 2 more rolls for grandmother. For each noon and evening, there was a fine white roll beside her plate, and these rolls she always put right into her pocket, because she could not eat them when she remembered grandmother had none at all, and with her poor old teeth was hardly able any longer to eat the tough black bread. Every day after dinner, Heidi would sit all by herself for 2 hours up in her room, since in the city they did not permit her to run out of doors as she had used to on the mountain meadow. She understood this rule now, and never broke it. Nor did she dare to have a talk with Sebastian across the hall in the dining room, for Miss Rottenmeier had forbidden that also, and she did not even dream of having a chat with Tinette. She always avoided the maid if she could, because Tinette spoke to her in a mocking tone and was forever making fun of her, and Heidi saw clearly what she was up to, and knew that Tinette was laughing at her. So Heidi would sit every day in her room, spending her time thinking of how green the mountain meadow must be growing by now, and of how all the yellow flowers must be gleaming in the sunlight. She would picture the snow and the mountains and the whole wide valley, and then Heidi would often feel as if she could not bear to be away from it a moment longer. Had her aunt not told her that she could go home whenever she wanted to? Thus it came about that one fine day Heidi gave in to her homesickness. She hurriedly packed up her rolls in the big red neckerchief, put on her straw hat, and set forth. But she had got no farther than the front door when her plans for escape were wrecked. She came upon Miss Rottenmeier, who was just back from a walk. This lady stopped and gazed at Heidi from top to toe. Her look seemed to dwell on the full red scarf at Heidi's neck, and then she gasped, "What sort of dressing is that? And what does this mean, anyway? Haven't I strictly forbidden you to ever go tramping about again? Yet here you are trying to steal away another time, and looking like a perfect little ragamuffin." "I wasn't going to tramp about. I was only going home," Heidi answered, frightened. What? Going home? Going home, if you please." Miss Rottenmeier clasped her hands in her excitement. "Running away! Oh, if Mr. Sesemann should hear of it, running away from his house! You'd better see he doesn't learn about it. And what is there, pray, that you don't like in his home? Aren't you treated better than you have a right to expect? Is there anything you lack? Did you ever in your life have as nice a home or such good things to eat,
or such good treatment as here. Tell me that."
"No," Heidi answered.
"And don't I know it?" the housekeeper went on excitedly. "There is nothing you do not have, and yet I cannot imagine such an ungrateful creature. You're so well off you don't know your own good luck."
But poor Heidi could no longer hold back her great loneliness. She burst out, "I just want to go home. And if I keep staying away any more, Schneehöppli will go on grieving for me, and grandmother is expecting me, and Distelfink will get a whipping if Peter doesn't get any cheese, and here you never see the sun say good night to the mountains, and if the bird of prey should fly over Frankfurt, he would scream ever so much louder because so many folks sit together and get cross with each other, and never climb up on the rocks where it's good for them to be."
"Mercy me! The child has gone crazy!" Miss Rottenmeier cried out.
She flew in terror up the stairs and ran straight into Sebastian, who was just starting down.
"Carry the unfortunate thing right up," she called to him, while she rubbed her head with her hand, for she had received a good hard bump. "Yes, yes, all right. Thank you, ma'am," Sebastian answered, rubbing his head likewise,
for his bump had been even worse. With flaming eyes, Heidi never budged from where she stood. Her whole body was shaking with nervous excitement.
"Well, what have you been doing this time?" Sebastian asked with a cheerful grin.
But when he looked more closely at Heidi, who was standing very still, he patted her gently on the shoulder and said,
"Oh, bah! The little mamselle mustn't take things so much to heart. Just be jolly, that's the way to do. Didn't she just this minute almost ram a hole in my head? But why be downhearted about it? Well, still on the same spot, I see. We've got to go back in, she said so."
At that, Heidi walked up the steps, but slowly and wearily, and not at all as she generally did. It made Sebastian unhappy to watch her. He followed along behind and spoke encouraging words.
"You mustn't mind so much. Just don't be so unhappy about it. Be brave, whatever happens. Our little mamselle is a regular soldier, has never shed a tear since she's been with us, while everybody knows that other girls of her age weep 12 times a day. The kittens are having a fine time upstairs, I'll bet. They're jumping all over the place and acting crazy. After a bit we'll just go up and take a look at them, when the lady in there isn't around to see."
Heidi nodded her head a little, but so sadly that it went straight to Sebastian's heart. He looked at her with much sympathy as she slunk off to her room. At supper that evening, Miss Rottenmeier did not say a word, but she kept casting strangely keen glances at Heidi, as if she thought she might try at any moment to do something quite unexpected. For her part, however, Heidi sat at her place, still as a mouse, and never made a move. She ate and drank nothing, but she slipped her roll quickly into her pocket. The next morning, when Herr Kandidat was coming up the steps, Miss Rottenmeier beckoned to him secretly to go into the dining room, and there she told him how greatly she feared that the change of scene and the new manner of living had driven the child out of her head. She told him of Heidi's trying to run away, and she repeated all of the strange words of Heidi's that she could remember. But the teacher soothed and comforted Miss Rottenmeier. He said that he was well aware, on the one hand, that Adelheid was a little odd, and yet, on the other hand, she was certainly in her right mind. He felt sure that little by little, with the right kind of treatment, he could restore her to a proper frame of mind, and this was what he had had in view all along. He thought her case was worse just now, because he simply had been unable to teach her the ABCs, since she could not learn her letters. After this talk, Miss Rottenmeier felt calmer, and excused Herr Kandidat to go on to his lessons. Later in the afternoon, she suddenly remembered the strange clothes Heidi had had on when she was trying to run away, and she made up her mind to put the child's clothes in suitable shape. by giving her some of Clara's things to wear before Mr. Sesemann should return. She talked this over with Clara, and when she found the invalid agreed with her and wanted to give Heidi a lot of clothes and linen and hats, the housekeeper went up to the child's room in order to look through her closet and see which of her dresses should be kept and which should be got rid of. But she was back again in a few minutes, looking very much disgusted. "Can you guess what I have found, Adelheid?" she cried aloud. "Such a thing as I never expected to see. In your closet, in your clothes closet, in the bottom of this closet. Adelheid, tell me, what have I discovered?" "A heap of little rolls. Yes, Clara, bread in her closet. A big heap of them stowed away." With that, Miss Rottenmeier called to the maid, who was in the dining room. "Tinette, take away the stale bread in Adelheid's closet, will you? And also the crushed straw hat that's on the table." "No, no," Heidi screamed. "I must keep the hat, and the rolls are for grandmother." Heidi tried to rush after Tinette, but the housekeeper held her in a firm grip. "You stay here. The rubbish will be put where it belongs," she said, as she hung on to Heidi. Then the child threw herself down on Clara's couch and began to weep. Her wailing grew louder and more bitter, and she kept saying over and over in her grief, "Now grandmother won't have any more rolls. They were for grandmother, and now they're all gone and she won't have any." And Heidi sobbed as if her heart would break. Miss Rottenmeier ran out of the room. Clara was scared. "Don't cry so, please, Heidi," she begged, "but listen to me. Look here, I promised to give you just as many rolls for grandmother when you go home, or even more of them. And they'll be fresh and soft ones, too, while yours would have gotten all hard. They were stale already. Just don't cry so, Heidi." It was some time before Heidi could hold back her sobs, but all the while she understood that Clara was comforting her, and it helped her greatly, or she never would have been able to stop crying. And Heidi had to be told several times about the new rolls, and asked Clara again and again, while her speech was still interrupted by sobbing, "Sure you'll give me just as many as I had for grandmother?" Each time Clara answered, "Honest, truly I will, and more too, if only you won't be sad any longer." Heidi's eyes were still red from weeping when she came down to supper, and when she saw the roll by her place, she had to start sobbing anew, but this time she held on to herself, for she knew that one must be quiet when at table. Now this evening, whenever Sebastian got close to Heidi, he would act in the strangest way. He would point first at his own head, and then at Heidi's. Then he would nod and wink, as if he wanted to say, "Don't you care? I saw what was up, and I looked out for everything." Later, when Heidi went to her room and was going to creep into bed, why, there lay her crushed straw hat tucked under the spread. She pulled out the old hat delightedly, crumpled it even more in a fit of joy, wrapped it up in a handkerchief, and thrust it out of sight, far back in her closet. It was Sebastian who had hidden the little hat under the coverlet. He had been in the dining room with Tinette when she was called by Miss Rottenmeier, and he had heard Heidi's cries of grief. So he had followed Tinette, and when she came from the child's room with her load of bread and the hat on top of it, he had snatched the hat and said to her, "I'll attend to that for you." And so, after all, he had saved it for Heidi, to her great delight. And that is what he was trying to tell her during supper, to cheer her up. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to Heidi. I'd love to hear your suggestions for future stories, so please send an email to me at kluker at marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.